Hey everyone, welcome back to the Brawn Body Podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Dan and I'm the founder of Brawn Body and I host this podcast. We release a new episode every week. And this week we're excited to be bringing you a great episode all about core training. So everything you've ever wanted to know about your abs, how to train them, how to pair exercises together for optimal results, which exercises to do versus not to do, the relevant anatomy of your abs, so all about those muscles. Lots of awesome, exciting information. And to help me do it, I'm excited to welcome Erik Caplan to the show. So a little bit about Erik. Erik is a 2017 graduate of Westchester University's Exercise Science program, and he's currently my classmate at Lebanon Valley College, where we're both studying to be doctors of physical therapy. Erik is also a certified strength and conditioning specialist from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Currently, Erik trains people on his own, virtually from home because of the whole COVID thing. So with that, please join me in welcoming Erik to the show. And now we're going to dive into the anatomy of the core. So, do you want to start?
That sounds like a good plan. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. Would you like to start us off here?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that first off, I'll start by saying that I think when it comes to the core, there's a kind of a definition problem, and I think that generally speaking, there are a lot of fitness communities out there that kind of look at the core as the rectus abdominis, that six-pack muscle. So although that is kind of where we start, that's where we start the conversation about the core. There's a lot more than that. You also have the internal obliques, the external obliques, which kind of create that kind of internal corset of the abdominal cavity that creates side flexion, rotation, anti-rotation, bracing, all that good stuff, which I'm sure we'll go into in a lot more detail. And then you get into kind of the deeper core muscles like the transverse abdominis, which you hear about all the time as being that bracing muscle that creates a powerful braking mechanism that allows you to produce movements outside of the core more effectively and efficiently. So, when you hear a therapist or a strength coach say, take a punch. So you kind of think about what it would feel like to brace yourself for a punch. That's that transverse abdominis that's contracting to create that sensation. You also have the muscles that you don't really think about quite as much, like the erector spinae, which is comprised of the iliocostalis, the longissimus, and the spinalis, these long muscles that run down the vertical axis of the spine, connecting down to the iliac crest, which is those hip structures that you can kind of feel if you palpate to the sides of your hips that are kind of sticking out through the skin. And they also run, all the way up to the skull as well. So, the core is a little bit more complex than I think people expect it to be. And when you look at the anatomy, there's a lot more going on there than just, again, that six-pack muscle, the rectus abdominis. It's a multifunctional, multidimensional, piece of anatomy or set of anatomy, I guess I should say, that has a lot of different functions, everything from creating movement to respiratory function, to gastric function, to cardiovascular function. So there's really a lot going on there.
Right, definitely. And just kind of looking at some of what you just delve into there. So, you really hit deep on the different obliques, the transversus and the erector spinae there. And the transversus especially, that's the muscle we're constantly cueing people about in exercises, in lifting. So, when we want someone to do a squat, for example, if they're going to do a heavy barbell squat, we want to make sure they have a tight core to protect their back. So that's the muscle we're really going after with that. And oddly enough, when we think about training, when we think about athletics, most of what we're after is in the transversus, the obliques, and the back. We don't think of the rectus as much in sports. So whether it's football, lacrosse, soccer, we don't see as much of a need to have a strong trunk flexor. Whereas we do need the rotation, the anti-rotation, the ability to brace and connect movement in the lower body to movement in the upper body, so to speak, some kind of continuous muscular system.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think that there is a role for the rectus abdominis for sure. I think that it just tends to be that, that muscle that's activated predominantly in something like a sit-up or a crunch. And it's like one of the first exercises you learn. So, of course, it's kind of the muscle you think about the most without a deep anatomical knowledge. But, yeah, I think it has a role. When it comes down to it, it does, comprise that whole anterior compartment of the abdomen. So, it definitely has a role in core stability, but you're right, there is a lot more going on here that's creating movement. We don't typically move in a single plane at a time through our daily lives. We're moving in multiple planes, and we need the core to be active in a lot of different ways to serve us, throughout our days.
Right.
And especially, like you said, doing athletic movements, like jumping, twisting, lifting, pulling, things like that.
Right, and that's something I know we're going to dive into a little bit more later is multi-directional core work. I know that's kind of your specialty really, is breaking out of the sagittal plane for exercises. So for people who don't know the anatomical planes, the sagittal plane is any kind of forward and backwards type of movement. So something like a bicep curl. The transverse plane is anything side to side, so like a torso twist or rotation. And the frontal plane is anything, think of like a line going through the middle of your body, dividing it into a front and a back. This would be that plane, so anything like a shoulder lateral raise, anything to the side. So we're going to go into how to work your core in all those planes and more at the same time. So yeah, we'll be talking about that training a little bit more later. There's also a couple other smaller muscles I want to bring up real quick. So first is the quadratus lumborum, or the QL, and this is one most people probably haven't heard of before. But Gray Cook and Stuart McGill, who are two huge names in the realm of back pain and training, they really found a lot of clinical significance to the QL, which connects your iliac crest, so Erik mentioned that earlier, to your upper four lumbar vertebra. And this little guy does a little bit of everything. Side bending, pelvic rotation, back extension, anterior pelvic tilting. It stabilizes the pelvis and the lumbar spine in all planes. And this is a muscle that clinically, I think we've seen a lot of people with tightness in these muscles from sitting down so much, especially with poor posture.
Yeah, totally agree. And again, not only does it produce movement, it's also part of that bracing mechanism in the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. So it's, again, a multifunctional core muscle that produces pressure within the abdomen so that you can produce fluid movements. And it also does produce that hip hiking mechanism and contributes to side bending and twisting and all that good stuff as well.
Right. And even though we've talked about what we would consider the musculature of the core, there's some things that we wouldn't consider that would contribute to core stability or core function that do. So when we talk about like a deadlift, for example, we always have a client or patient tighten their lats before they lift the bar, because those lats run from the hip to the arm and they kind of connect everything together. So even just tightening your lats can help you hold your core steady and stable and maintain a proper deadlift in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think, most people would agree that really the core is, pointing towards the musculature that adheres to the spine and keeps the spine stable. So we're not just talking, about the inferior musculature or even the musculature at the midsection. Like you said, we're also talking about the latissimus dorsi, which you can imagine it's a massive muscle. It's not just a shoulder extensor, an internal rotator, all that good stuff, an adductor. It's also a muscle that, is playing a huge role in bracing the entire upper part of the body for big lifts like deadlifts and squats and good stuff, all that good stuff. So, it's again helping to produce a really stable spine due to its articulation down the, cervical and thoracic spine, or thoracic spine, I should say.
Right. And you brought up a great point there with how it includes everything that connects to the spine. So we often don't think of other muscles that are related to the axial skeleton, like the diaphragm and the pelvic floor too, but they kind of form the roof and the floor of the abdominal cavity. I know we've discussed this quite a bit before. Before you lift, say you're going to do your 1 rep max squat, before you lift, you take that nice deep breath in, and that contracts your diaphragm. So your diaphragm pulls down. Think of where your diaphragm is around your stomach. So that's going to shrink the volume in your abdominal cavity. And we know that smaller volume will be matched by increased pressure. So it'll help keep the back stable. And I think that's something, I know I've actually struggled with that in the past. I don't know about you, but for a while I've struggled to activate the diaphragm and the pelvic floor effectively during exercises sometimes. But once I learned how to do it, it made a huge difference, not just in my strength, but in my mobility too, because I had more stability where I needed it.
So I think that Mary Massery's model, called the soda can model, is a really good way to kind of describe the interplay between the thoracic and abdominal cavities as kind of like as a pressure system, so to speak. So basically the way she breaks it down is you look at a can of soda, and, when it's full and when the tab is closed, you have a pressure-filled system, and that pressure is kind of what maintains the integrity of the can. So as soon as you open that can of soda, all of a sudden the pressure flows out and you don't have a stable structure anymore. You could crush it very easily. So basically what she's saying is you can take that soda can model and apply it to the human body, where the tab where the soda can opens is kind of like the vocal folds where your mouth would open. And then you have the thoracic cavity on the top, separated in the middle with the diaphragm, and at the bottom is the abdominal cavity. So, structurally, a soda can, just the aluminum in and of itself is not that strong. It's actually the pressure that gives the can integrity and gives the can strength. So that's kind of like the pressure that we're able to produce in our bodies to create, a rigid structural, series of segments, so to speak. So, basically what she's saying is that, it's more than just a musculoskeletal system when we talk about the core. It's also, all of the contents of those cavities and the contents of those systems. So, you could have something, and they're also very interrelated. So you could have something like a respiratory issue, a dysfunctional respiratory system, where some of the respiratory muscles, like the intercostals, for example, that kind of line the rib cage. If those are dysfunctional, you can see some, regional dysfunction down in the abdomen, just because you have this kind of flawed pressure system. So, really good example of this, and to kind of illustrate it into something more familiar, is, say, like a pregnant woman who has a human growing inside of her, putting a lot of pressure on the abdominal cavity, obviously, and kind of stretching the pelvic floor muscles into a suboptimal position, so they're not contracting and firing properly. And then when a pregnant woman, coughs, sneezes, a function of the respiratory system, all of a sudden you have a lot of times urinary incontinence, because the pelvic floor isn't functioning properly, and that urinary function, isn't operating properly either. So you can kind of see the interplay between these systems. and we can actually train out of this. It's great to know all this information, but what's really important is what can we do about it? Can we strengthen these muscles that become dysfunctional to create, a better pressure gradient within the body?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And that's a great analogy to help understand it and drive it home. But
Yeah.
ultimately, like you said, this is our pressure system. So dysfunction here impacts everything else. Like I've even got a study I found this morning and linked it in here about how
Sure.
core stability is needed for optimal rotator cuff strength. And
Yeah.
if you're a PT, you need to make sure that your patients are working their core while doing rotator cuff work, which it's just
Yeah.
crazy to see all the connections here.
Yeah, it's that idea of regional interdependence. It's like if you see dysfunction, in the shoulder, there's a good chance it can, but there's a good chance that that dysfunction doesn't originate in the shoulder, and you should probably start looking elsewhere before you start, really hammering into the shoulder. So there's that idea that proximal strength and proximal tension equals distal strength and distal movement and ability. So if you can create that proximal strength in the torso and in the core, there's a good chance you're going to have more functionality and more mobility in the distal structures, like when you're lifting weights. So it's a really important idea when it comes to strength training.
Right, exactly. All right, so I think we've really dug deep on the anatomy of the core here. We've used names of muscles most people haven't ever heard of before.
Right.
So we're really getting in there good. But going after training now. So, all right, we know what the core is, we know what makes it up, but how are we going to strengthen it? And I threw one bullet in here that I get asked a lot, and I know it was a big myth or debate about this, but do I have to train my core directly? So if
Right.
you squat heavy, deadlift heavy, bench press, whatever, is that enough? Or should I, train the core on its own? And
Right.
I know I have opinions about that, but I'm curious to hear what yours are before we get into World War III
Yeah,
here.
well, I mean, I think it's still a big question. I don't know if there is, a perfect answer to the question, but I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it certainly doesn't hurt to train the core directly. But that's not to say that doing something like a heavy loaded front squat or a deadlift or a back squat, barbell back squat, is not training the core. I think that they're all useful in their own ways, but I also don't think it makes sense to be narrow-sighted in your approach to training. So, I think you have to ask yourself when you are training core directly, like, what is the carryover effect? So just because you can use strength to create stiffness and rigidity during a dynamic movement doesn't mean that you'll be able to employ that strength against a dynamic movement, if that makes sense. So, if just because I can do 1,000 Russian twists, or just because I can do, 100 leg raises in a row, does that mean that I can transfer that strength adequately to a deadlift or to a squat? That's kind of up in the air, but I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there are some core exercises that are really beneficial to supplementing those movements or complementing those movements, probably more specifically. So again, I don't know if there's a perfect answer, but I think for me, I don't think it makes sense to short yourself on the direct core training. I think that it does have an application. If anything, it at least contributes to the motor learning process, so you can feel what those deep core muscles feel like, and even the superficial core muscles. Some people, again, are really working on that six-pack, but they're not working on rotation, so maybe they don't know what it feels like to contract the obliques adequately. So, I think that having a dynamic approach to core training is really important, but just having a plan is probably the most important thing. What is your intention? What are you trying to do by training the core? Are you trying to build a six-pack? If you are, then, go ahead and do 1,000 crunches. That's your prerogative, but I think that having a clear understanding of what the core is and, how it can contribute to the movement process is pretty important.
Right, I have to agree with you. And you bring up a great point as far as demand specificity there with what is your goal. So if your goal is to build a insane 1 rep max deadlift and you're a specialist in the deadlift, then odds are your core training is going to look a lot differently than someone who is a football linebacker or a soccer player. And, there's even going to be gender differences here in how we train the core. For the most part, the programming is the same between men and women, but for a female athlete, I might add in more direct core training because of the need for proximal stabilization, as we touched on before, for distal mobility. So, we know female athletes, especially soccer players, are more prone for ACL type injuries and that sort of thing. So I'm going to try and do everything I can as a therapist or a trainer to prevent that. So if it includes an extra set of core, then yeah, we're going to throw that in there. But no, I like that. There's no one size fits all approach for this.
Exactly, yeah.
I forget what his name was. There was a bodybuilder a few years back who was winning competitions, and he said he never trained his core directly. He said he just always tensed as hard as he could on things like bench press and stuff. But
and there's objective data or objective information to suggest that worked perfectly well for that guy,
Right.
So I think that's a really good example. But at the same time, say you have an overhead athlete that's primarily engaged in overhead activity, maybe only doing front squats to train this person's core isn't an awesome idea. Maybe we have to be more dynamic and starting incorporating the upper quarter a little bit more, for it to make sense to that athlete. It's sport-specific training. It's human-specific training. These things can be situational and, they're going to have context. So I think you need to be mindful of that.
Right. And like you said before, like some people might do 1,000 sit-ups, but the sit-up might not even be the most effective exercise for building that six-pack. So there's an article, another one I found this morning. I just got into the reading today, I guess, and they were saying that EMG activity showed more core activation throughout the entire core system in exercises like a Swiss ball pike or a decline push-up than your traditional bent knee sit-up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that people get a little bit dogmatic with their training sometimes, and they start kind of buying into a system that probably doesn't have any, supporting evidence anymore. Maybe I think that people need to really sit back and look at where the data is, where the information is. And, I don't necessarily think that means every time you go to do a new support that particular lift, but I think that having an intention that's grounded in good information is pretty important. So like you said, open your eyes to other information that might be out there. Maybe your crunch regimen just isn't it. Maybe it's not what you think it is, and maybe it's not doing for you what you think it's doing.
Definitely. That's a great point. And while we're on the topic of exercises, I know we touched on this a little bit, but we'll maybe each go over like our top 3 core exercises. I know mine have changed significantly in the past few months compared to what they were before. And again, like you said, this is just a concept of learning new things and adapting to that new knowledge.
Sure.
So let's just go back and forth here. My first one, and this has become a staple in my training, is the hanging leg raise. And I picked this up from Pivel's book, Hardstyle Abs, where he completely changed my concept of core training. So his main point in the book is so many people want to build muscle in their abs, yet they sit by and do 4 sets of 30 reps or 50 reps or insanely high rep counts. When he's like,
Yeah.
when we want to build muscle in, say, our biceps, we typically use a higher load for less reps. So something like a 40-pound dumbbell for curls at 8 reps or something.
Right.
And he said for core, we're kind of limited in our ability to do that in some cases. Some exercises we can load and it's great. Other exercises, kind of hard to load. But what we should do instead of increasing weight is increase the demand. So that's where the hanging leg raise came in, is I had always done knee raises. So I thought, why not take it to the next level? And doing these in sets of three or four sets, about 4 to 8 reps, just doing them very slow and controlled, no kipping, none of that, holding constant tension throughout the quads, throughout the pelvic floor, the diaphragm, the abdomen, the glutes. I've been getting insane core results from this simple movement. And it's kind of working in a little bit of a hollow body hold in it too, because you're holding yourself at the bottom of the bar with that hollow hold position, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a good point to be made, is that, why are we treating the abdominal area any differently than we treat other muscles? Now, I think that you also have to take that idea with a grain of salt. I mean, and this might be somewhat controversial, but I think you have to think about how the muscles of the core want to be trained, so to speak, physiologically. So, when you think about it, these aren't muscles that are necessarily, producing big, giant movements with long lever arms throughout the day. They're muscles that are contracting rhythmically, and they're contracting situationally, kind of in short bursts, and they're doing that over the course of the day constantly. So we're talking predominantly about highly oxidative, efficient fibers, type 1 fibers probably, that, want to be trained for endurance rather than trained for power or strength or something like that. So like you said, I think it's a nice balance between testing the endurance of these muscles and also applying a load to the muscle that can be sustained over a period of time. So something like a leg raise, like you said, requires kind of a high endurance element, and it also requires that strength element, and also requires the ability to kind of hone in and feel some of those deep muscles of the core that maybe aren't that familiar to you right off the bat.
Right, exactly. And speaking of deep core muscles, I know that your favorite exercise tend to be ones that really dig in deep and hit those things that we talked about earlier that most people don't even think of.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So two of my top three, I can't necessarily claim as my own. I certainly didn't create them. They're part of Stuart McGill, who you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
They're part of his big 3 core exercises. So his big 3 are the bird dog. And let me think. There is a segmental sit-up that he does, like a modified sit-up. And what's the third one? I'm trying to think. Bird dog, sit up. Oh, and the side plank. So 2 out of 3, I've kind of just copy and pasted into my top 3, with the exception of 1. But I think that the side plank is super important, that frontal plane stability, so strengthening the lateral muscles of the core, muscles that don't get a lot of love typically, and some muscles that aren't even thought to be part of the core typically. So muscles like the glute medius, which has a significant influence on lateral stability and lateral core stability, is really taxed during something like a side plank. So, that lateral hip stability can be very important. And it also plays into something we talked about earlier, the quadratus lumborum, which kind of stretches from that last rib down to the posterior and lateral pelvis. So strengthening those muscles in a very targeted fashion, I think, is really important. It also does hit some of those more, well-known, quote-unquote, core muscles, like the internal and external obliques of the lateral core. So it really kind of hits from superficial to deep some of the muscles that don't typically get a lot of attention when training core. In addition to that, the other Stuart McGill influence exercise is the bird dog and bird dog variation. So, as a personal trainer, this is something I absolutely incorporate into every client's program, whether they're, a seasoned athlete or someone that's in their 60s and 70s that doesn't have a lot of exercise experience. The bird dog's great because it is like textbook core bracing with a movement of the upper and lower extremity. So it covers a lot of things. It covers abdominal bracing, and it covers coordination, and it covers anti-rotation kind of all in one shot. And it really teaches you how to brace the core and produce movement at the upper and lower extremity while bracing the core. So it's a great exercise to employ. And the third one, I guess, is it okay if I just keep rolling through to my last one? I don't want to...
Yeah, keep going. I like it.
Yeah. So the third one, again, not an exercise I created, not part of Stuart McGill's list, but something that I really like that takes a lot of those concepts and makes them actionable is anti-rotation exercises, specifically with a band if you have one, a long band. So there's a million different variations of anti-rotation that you can do. I usually start out with a simple Palloff press. So a Palloff press is when you take a band, usually about, between hip and shoulder height, you put that band on a stretch, and you're basically pressing from the chest to an extended position. And so the band is trying to pull you in rotation, and you're resisting that rotation for at least a brief period of time. And you can progress that really easily. You can start increasing the length of the hold of the Palloff press, or you can take the pressing element out and just stay in a press and then walk laterally so that you're putting more tension on the band, and then walking back to the origination or the origin point of the band to kind of take the tension off, so you can release and create tension that way. So you can imagine there's so many ways that you can play with the plane of motion. There's so many ways you can mess with the point of force application and the lever arms. There's really a lot that you can do with anti-rotation. And I've recently in my own training started incorporating it into a dead bug, where you're laying on the back with the shoulders and hips flexed, kind of in like a reverse all fours position from your back. And playing with anti-rotation that way. So kind of taking the same concept and then doing a dead bug with the anti-rotation happening with the band at my upper extremity. So the legs aren't, working against any resistance, but the upper body is. So it kind of teaches you to brace the upper body while moving the lower body. And then you can mess with it the opposite way and have the band applied to the legs, and you're moving the arms through the dead bug motion. So, I could go on about, different variations forever, but you kind of get the idea that there's a lot you can do with anti-rotation. And, there's a lot of application to core stability with that.
Definitely. And you really got deep there and covered a lot. But the dead bug, that's one that I used to do a lot. And my favorite variation was a Swiss ball between the hands and the knees. And
Yes.
when you're moving one, you're maximally contracting and bracing the other. So it's a forceful contraction, but it's those opposite sides paired and making them work together. Definitely a great exercise there.
I like that one a lot because it plays into the importance of isometrics too. Isometric rotation. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I pulled my own article, before this conversation, a Stuart McGill article. It's a great one that I think anybody that wants to learn more about core exercise should look into. And it's about the effect of long-term isometrics training on the core and torso stiffness. And basically, he compared novice clients, personal training clients to, I think it was like Muay Thai kickboxers or something like that, which have great core stability, of course. And basically found that in both groups, the isometric training was more effective in producing core and torso stiffness. So, I think there's a huge application for isometrics like that in any training program. I definitely think that they should be utilized.
Definitely. And we talked about loading a few minutes ago, and that makes me wonder too, about the potential for core activation in almost like a barbell hold. So not a full squat, but load a bar with 500 pounds, or, more than whatever your 1 rep max squat is, and just brace and hold. So you're not going to be dynamic or moving whatsoever, just holding, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think loading with a barbell lift is actually a really effective way to kind of balance those two concepts of loading the muscles and also kind of forcing them into an isometric. So, if you take, a squat, for example, and even just standing up with a barbell on your back, and you feel what your core does, you feel what your entire midsection does, that's bracing. If you didn't do that, you would collapse into a heap almost immediately, no matter how much weight you have on, whether it's, 100 pounds or 500 pounds. You need to brace the abdomen and the core to just maintain that position, to just have a barbell on your back. So like you said, even coming down into an isometric, the bottom end of a squat, now you're really talking about loading those muscles on a really high level and then maintaining that position, and also kind of loading some of the muscles that are, I don't know what you call it, maybe like ancillary core muscles, like the glutes that have, distal attachments and proximal attachments, on the spine, well, not on the spine necessarily, but on the pelvis, and kind of indirectly up onto this, but taxing those muscles as well, which kind of are supporting the core, is a really good idea. And I think from an isometric standpoint, it could be really effective.
Right. And I mean, with all the exercises you've mentioned, you can incorporate so many different muscle movements and activations through them. Like you said, side plank variations. You could throw a mini band around the knees and do a isometric glute abduction hold with your hip kind of way up, or you could extend it and get more glute max. You could do the same with the bird dog. You could do a mini band around the knees. There's so many variations there for you to really make the most of your core training and train, like we said, multi-dimensional instead of just one thing at a time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that the idea of progressive overload always applies. I think that the more you do these exercises, the simple stuff like a bird dog, I don't even want to call the bird dog simple, because if you're bracing correctly, the bird dog can be incredibly difficult for a long period of time. If it's 5 to 10 reps for a 10-second hold, that should be really hard, because you're really taxing those deep core muscles. But I think, making sure you're applying that concept of progressive overload. If it starts getting too simple, if you're starting to adapt, find a way to make it more challenging. Don't just settle and make that the end of the story. Find a way to add some type of instability, add a different element to the exercise. So like you said, adding a mini band to kind of engage some of the lateral hip muscles or the posterior hip muscles. You could add something like a Dynadisc, like an unstable surface underneath the elbow or underneath the feet to create some instability. So now you're working against not only that isometric, but you're also working against an uneven, unstable surface. So there's kind of another motor learning component to the exercise. So I think all of that's really important, and kind of being creative with it. Not only being creative yourself, but kind of going out there and looking for as much information as you can. There's so many good resources out there with exercise ideas, just entire archives and libraries of different options. And yeah, just really making sure that you continue to test yourself when you find that things are getting a little bit too easy.
Right, definitely. Definitely. So that was all great stuff and all phenomenal exercises, and they're all things that you can pretty much do at home for the most part if you're still training at home, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
So the only couple exercises I'd consider adding are, and we've kind of hit on this already, is just some kind of heavy loaded carry. So loading the core with the bracing type of action and then moving with it. But as I said, we've already hit on that mostly already. And then, as I said with the hanging leg raise, having that hollow body hold position that's become one of my favorite things to modify as we go about a workout or with training, is throwing in rocking variations or single arm dumbbell press while in a hollow body hold to work the bracing and anti-extension with anti-rotation, and now incorporating that upper extremity type movement too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think loaded, carries are such a good way and such a simple. Well, I don't want to say simple because the exercises themselves are super challenging, but just like a really conceptually simple way to engage the core in kind of an alternative manner. You don't really think about just walking with a weight as being taxing on the core, but man, it really is. And you kind of touched on some of the variations there that make it even more challenging, kind of messing with different upper extremity movements while you're walking, adding weight. And I would also argue that kind of switching up your lever arm situation can be pretty beneficial too, bringing that weight outside of your base of support. So now you're taxing balance on top of, a standard core exercise, just adding another element. But again,
No, definitely. That's a great point, is just constantly changing things up, like you said, being dynamic, but moving around, so to speak. So whether it's getting outside the base of support, changing the lever arm. So if you're doing, say, a weighted carry, the difference between a single arm farmer's walk to a waiter walk or bottoms up kettlebell walk or something along those lines, each task is going to place new demands on your core. So just little tweaks for big changes.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that doing all of that, and then also not forgetting what the foundational movements are with the foundational exercises. So it doesn't hurt just because, you're doing a bottoms up farmer's carry unilaterally doesn't mean you can't go back to a bird dog and just practice the basics, because I think sometimes we can get stuck on that path of progression and forget about the foundational movements that everything starts with.
Right, exactly. And going back to foundational movements and little tweaks, for those of you who are still set on, you have to do sit-ups, have to do crunches, that's all you've ever done, there's one variation that I found very effective and beneficial, and that's the Janda sit-up. So with this one, you're either going to use a band or someone else pulling your legs out away from you when you're in that sit-up position, and you're going to have to hold your legs in. And doing so is going to place an isometric demand on your hamstrings, because otherwise your legs are going to straighten on you. And the hamstrings, as we know, extend the hip, so that will inhibit the hip flexors like the psoas, which tend to dominate the crunch and other abdominal flexion type exercises. So this way, when you do sit-ups, if you're still on that route, all of the training is going right to the rectus abdominis, and you're not tightening down your hip flexors more and more and more each time. So little tweak, big results.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think something that people often do overlook is the fact that the hip flexors can, in some cases, play a massive role in crunching and sit-up type movements. I mean, you're producing a really strong hip flexion movement. And I think that, if you start to notice that you're experiencing chronically tight hip flexors or kind of some weird low back pain that you're not familiar with, and you are someone that's doing a ton of sagittal plane, flexion type movements, maybe you have to look at the stuff that you're doing excessively and kind of pairing that up with some of the weird insidious pain that you're experiencing.
Right, exactly. So, well, I think we hammered exercises and training really well there. Just to kind of bring it home here, so everyone now knows different exercises, training, but as far as how you're going to put it in your workouts, I know most of the time we look at core training towards the end of a workout, we rarely do core first. And what's your take on the core training daily versus every other day versus once a week kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that it should be realized that core training is happening every time that you're doing, an exercise where you're moving through space, when you're not using a machine or you're not using, whatever, structured exercise equipment. When you're moving weight through space, you are essentially doing some form of core training. Now, that doesn't speak to the specific core training that we've been talking a lot about. So I think that it makes sense to treat these muscles like you would treat other muscles of the body. You need to give them adequate rest from a day-to-day perspective, just like you would other muscle groups. So I think that doing, 2 to 3 days of, structured core exercise as a part of your workout every week is probably a decent idea, maybe even a less at the very beginning. And then using, the motor learning that you're getting from that training and applying it to bigger movements like a squat or a deadlift, where, you are taxing those muscles, but maybe not in a traditional sense. So kind of just using that core training that you're doing a couple of days out of the week and then applying what you learn from it to other training that you're doing where the core is kind of an outside mechanism that's not directly being taxed during the exercise.
Right, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And with that, people often ask me, sets or reps, or when you're programming for a client, you always put that stuff in there because you don't want them to be left guessing. But as far as that goes, I usually fall in the 3 to 4 set range. And if it's a rep exercise, usually 8 to 12 rep range. Or if it's a time exercise, usually somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute with a rest period that's relatively short, like 30 to 45 seconds to keep the intensity up with core work. Do you usually do something similar, or are you kind of different in that?
I do, yeah. I think that I'm pretty similar to your approach. Again, I think that we should be training these muscles for endurance. I think that's what a lot of the data and the research points to. Again, these are muscles that are really good at firing all day rhythmically, so we should probably be training them as such under a load. So I think training for endurance in, slightly higher volumes, but, making it manageable, I think 3 to 4 sets in that, like 10 to 20 rep range is probably reasonable, depending on what you're doing, though. I mean, maybe if you're doing, we'll go back to the bird dog as an example again. If you're doing some bird dog, maybe you want to incorporate isometric holds, which is kind of an element of endurance, or kind of, hits on that metabolic endurance pathway. So I think that maybe you do 5 or 6 reps, but you're doing 10-second holds. So it's an endurance exercise, lower repetition, but when all is said and done, you're holding that position for, cumulatively like a minute or two, which is a pretty long time. So
Definitely. And you can even get dynamic with each repetition you do with an exercise. So if you are doing your bird dog, for example, if you do that first rep super slow, 10, 20 seconds for one rep, follow that with a super fast one, as fast as you can while still maintaining good form. And then you can break that up into components. Move your arm through space really fast while you move your leg really slow, and vice versa. Just start changing little things because, again, in life, in athletics, you're not ever going to be doing the same thing and same task over and over again.
Yeah, so I think that if I had to make 2 suggestions on kind of just giving you, a source of perspective and a source of information surrounding the core that are really beneficial and were really helpful to me to understanding kind of the biomechanics and the physiological implications of the core, I'd highly, highly recommend looking at all of Mary Masry's work. And of course, like we've mentioned a couple of times, the work of Stuart McGill, who's just like a master of spinal biomechanics. I mean, he's literally like the godfather. So highly recommend looking at the work of Stuart McGill and Mary Masry. They both do really awesome stuff, and they kind of like are what influenced most of my end of the conversation. So I would definitely recommend that.
Definitely. And if you're not the PubMed research type, I know Stuart McGill even has like books that you can pick up at like Amazon or online, and they're very easy reads. So if you're not the research type, there's simple things out there. But great episode today. Awesome information. And I hope anyone listening to this really learned some things, because I know I learned some things today. But Erik, as always, thank you for being here and for your time and for troubleshooting through all of the audio issues that we may or may not have experienced, depending on how good my editing was when we published this. So,
yeah, thank you for having me, Dan. I appreciate it.
Of course. And again, if you want to learn more about Erik or follow along with him, you can check out his Instagram at Erik Scott Caplan. That's Erik with a K. Or you can find him on LinkedIn, and the link for that is in the show notes over on the blog. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Podcast. Stay tuned for another awesome episode next week, where we're going to be going over the glutes, all about glute training. So it's almost like we've got summer body week going on right now between the core this week and the glutes next week. But anyways, thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next week.